Jack Johnson was a black man back when white people lynched Negroes on weekends. They would send him letters saying, "You fighting a white man, and if you knock him out, we'll kill you." He said, "Just kill my black buggers, I'm gonna knock this white man cold." I know I'm bad, but he was crazy.
This was the white man's crown, and everybody hated him for it.
Jack Johnson was a man 100 years ahead of his time. Born in 1878, Jack grew up in Galveston, Texas, in a racially tolerant neighborhood. While Galveston may have been an oasis of tolerance, the rest of the world was decidedly not. Jack Johnson was bold enough to attempt to declare his personal independence in a world defined by race. In his search for money, he didn't have to grow from the ground. Jack started taking part in events called battle royales. These were contests where several black men were blindfolded and made to fight while the crowds drank and cheered and placed bets with blood money. Jack learned to fight mostly without the aid of his sight. He learns to read his opponent's movements like Braille, and he starts winning these brutal, degrading contests with alarming consistency. Jack builds enough of a reputation blindfolded that eventually he starts taking and winning regular boxing matches. While boxing was less segregated than the rest of the country, a man of any race could earn a living assuming he could fight. Jack Johnson could certainly fight. The only title in boxing that was truly segregated was the heavyweight championship. While black fighters had claimed the titles at the lower weights, the discrimination against black heavyweights ran deep until Jack Johnson got too good and too loud to simply ignore. At the turn of the century, prize fighting was technically illegal. In 1901, he fights a veteran knockout artist in Joe Choinsky. While Choinsky beat Jack, they ended up in jail, sharing a cell for prize fighting. An enterprising sheriff saw an opportunity and snuck 2 pairs of gloves to them so they could spar. It was in a jail cell where Jack was put through his professional paces. The sparring prisoners started drawing crowds, and the sheriff started charging to watch. Soon released on good behavior and with a few new tricks in his bag, Jack would make his run at the segregated title. In 1902, Johnson makes his mark on the division when he upsets the 2-time former colored champion, Frank Childs. The next year, he faced off with the reigning champion, Denver Ed Martin, and beat him on points over 20 rounds. Jack Johnson's reign over the colored title alone made him a great. Many of his most difficult opponents he met in defense of the colored title. While he was proud of his accomplishment, Jack wasn't satisfied holding a title with a qualifier like colored in its description. As Johnson began his march toward the championship and the old guard of boxing closed ranks against him, the white champion Jack wanted to fight was a tank of a man named Jim Jeffries. By 1904, Jeffries had defended the title 7 times against exclusively white contenders. He retired undefeated, never giving Jack a shot at the title. Jack took that personally. The next champion was decided when underdog Tommy Burns won a 20-round decision over Marvin Hart. Tommy defended his championship 11 times before finally agreeing to fight Jack after he purchased ringside seats and started taunting Tommy during his fights. Burns was eloquent in his defense in taking on Johnson, spoke a quote worthy enough to credit him as the first true world champion. No venue in either the US or the UK was willing to hold the fight for fear of a riot. The fight eventually found a home in Sydney, Australia.
With the understanding that if it got out of hand, the local constabulary would come in and stop the fight.
The moment Jack Johnson finally comes to grips with the white champion, he smiles a gold-toothed grin at the crowd. Every Jack Johnson fight was in front of mostly white crowds that showered him in racial slurs and threats of violence. Johnson smiled through it.
Within a few seconds, Burns was on the floor. Burns got up and was knocked down again.
Jack's mastery in the clinch made the champion a rag doll. Tommy looked like a teenager trying to wrestle with his new stepdad. Johnson controlled every second. The film is stopped by local police the moment Tommy is about to hit the floor. For the first time in history, it was unquestionable who was the best fighter in boxing. The boxing establishment searched for a white man able to beat him. It took them 7 years. Despite the occasional arrests, Jack Johnson was the freest black man in America. He did what he wanted, and the white world hated him for it. He lived a lavish lifestyle of cars, clothes, and had his own ideas on what race relations should entail. Jack Johnson is credited with desegregating more brothels than any man in America. He opened 2 mixed-race nightclubs, and he married 3 women, all of them white. The establishment was so thoroughly offended by Johnson's conduct that calls grew in the press for the retired, though still undefeated, Jim Jeffries to return and put Jack in his place. When Jeffries agreed, the public was whipped into a frenzy by the event that came to be called the Fight of the Century. Even men Jack thought of as friends, like his one-time mentor Joe Choinsky, defected to Jeffries' camp to instruct him on Jack's tendencies. None of those people were in the ring to help Jim Jeffries.
Jeffries somehow found the will to keep moving forward. But Johnson's sharp, accurate punches were taking a devastating toll.
Jack's spiderweb of a clinch game held the ex-champion in place as he literally and figuratively carried Jeffries, saving him from knockdowns only to prolong the show and ensure there was no talk of a fluke or rematch. Jack did whatever he wanted to the formerly undefeated champion, and Jeffries was finally allowed to lose in the 15th.
Jeffries' side called it quits.
When word got out, Race riots erupted across the country. Dozens were injured. 20 people died. Jack's biggest opponent would finally move against him. The U.S. government began to look at Jack Johnson for violating the Mann Act, a law made to prevent the trafficking of prostitutes and broadly enough to be used against anyone the authorities felt like deserved it. The words immoral purposes get applied anytime Jack leaves a state with his own wife in the passenger seat. He was found guilty by an all-white jury and sentenced to a year and a day. Jack skipped bail and flew to France. In Paris, the champion in exile is still defending his title. In 1914, he takes Frank Moran to a clear 20-round decision. Jack was never truly comfortable anywhere but the ring. Signs were starting to show that his intemperate lifestyle might be catching up to him. Jack would never again fight weighing less than 220 pounds. He was so famous that English troops in World War I began to refer to the German 150mm artillery as Jack Johnsons due to their black smoke on impact. Jack Johnson finally meets his match in Cuba against the biggest white hope yet. Jess Willard was 6'6", 240 pounds of Kansas farm boy strength. Jack took training lightly, having seen the big man box. Jess was far from a classical boxer, and Jack was sure he could KO him quickly. Jack started to hammer on the anvil that would ultimately break him. Willard was as advertised, a lumbering target. But the 45-round distance was a marathon. Jack landed early and often, but try as he might, he couldn't get Big Jess out of there. The tide slowly begins to turn on the 37-year-old champion. Jess jabbed and punched with patience. And after 26 grueling rounds, he was standing, and Jack Johnson wasn't. Rumors immediately swirled that Johnson had thrown the fight for some insidious payoff. But who goes 26 rounds to take a dive? Johnson returned to Europe and mostly gave up. He was still fighting, but he was now up to 240 pounds, until he finally got homesick enough to surrender to American authorities at the border. Jack spent his next year in Leavenworth. Jack was never the same fighter, but carries out his career to a drawn-out conclusion in 1931. Jack Johnson dies trying to get a meal at a segregated diner that refused to serve him. Drives off in a righteous fury. High speed and indignant rage rarely mix well, and Jack wraps his car around a telephone pole. He was rushed to the nearest segregated hospital, but couldn't go the distance. At a time when black men around the country lived as second-class citizens, Jack Johnson lived out loud. His renegade pursuit of freedom would come to redefine what a black man could be. His defiant 7-year reign stands as a beacon for generations of exceptional black men at odds with a society that admired their talent but hated their skin color. He asked neither permission nor forgiveness.